I stopped using ChatGPT for my finance work and I switched fully to Claude. And the truth is, it made my work significantly more effective immediately. Now you might be thinking, do I really need to learn another AI tool? And the reality is you don't actually, because from the base and from the very start, Claude works very similar to ChatGPT. But where it's different is that it goes beyond prompting and actually lets you build automated workflows. And that difference really matters because ChatGPT is not a bad tool. It's strong for drafting and for quick thinking. But every time I used it for something that actually mattered, like financial models or variance analysis or reporting, I ended up spending more time verifying the output than it would have taken to build it myself. So the answers might have looked right, but the logic didn't hold the line I have to draw. I don't need outputs that look correct. I need outputs that are correct, that are repeatable, and that are traceable. And that's where the shift happens. And in this video, I'll break down exactly where ChatGPT breaks in finance and what's changing and how AI is being used and why Claude operates differently at a system level so that you will know exactly when to use each one and where the real leverage exists. Now, if you want to go deeper into how these workflows actually look in practice, I share everything inside my free community. Why ChatGPT breaks in finance. So let me start with what actually goes wrong when you use ChatGPT for finance work, because the problem is not initially obvious. ChatGPT is good at producing responses that look like financial analysis. The formatting is clean, the language is precise, the structure follows what you would expect from a professional output, and that is exactly what makes it unreliable, because the errors are often embedded inside outputs that appear polished and complete, which means they're much harder to catch than something that's clearly wrong. Now this shows up consistently in standard finance tasks, ratio analysis, deferred tax calculations, revenue recognition scenarios. These are not edge cases. These are rule-based tasks that finance teams perform regularly. And ChatGPT produces answers for them that read as confident and structured, but contain logical or numerical errors that only surface when you manually reconstruct the calculation. So the risk is not just that the output is wrong. The risk is that it looks right and that you trust it before you verify it. Now the second problem is inconsistency. In finance, the same inputs need to produce the same outputs every time. That is the foundation of any repeatable process. Now ChatGPT does not work that way. Its outputs shift depending on how the question is phrased, what context is active, and what happened earlier in the session. You can give it the same data set and the same instruction twice, and you can get structurally different results. Now for one-off questions, that might be fine, but for a variance analysis that runs monthly or a model that needs to be updated quarterly, it makes the tool unreliable as a system. The third problem is that performance drops as tasks get more complex. So finance work is almost never a single calculation. It's a chain of dependent steps where each one relies on the accuracy of the previous one. The data extraction feeds into assumption setting, which feeds into the model, which feeds into the forecast, which feeds into the final report. Now ChatGPT handles individual steps reasonably well, but starts breaking when the logic needs to carry across these multiple stages. It drops assumptions, or it misapplies rules from earlier steps, or it loses context from the beginning of the conversation. Now in finance, even a small break in that chain can materially change the final output. The fourth problem is the one that matters the most in any regulated or audited environment. There is no audit trail. ChatGPT does not maintain a structured record of how it moved from input to output. There's no version control. There's no log of intermediate calculations and no way to trace a specific number back to the data it came from. Now in finance, the answer is only half the job. The other half is being able to show how you got there. And without that traceability, the output cannot be used in any context where accountability matters. And that last issue is something that most people do not realize until they have used it for a few months. ChatGPT creates a false sense of efficiency. It makes the first step faster, generating a draft or producing an initial analysis, getting something on screen quickly. But it does not reduce the verification work. You still have to rebuild the logic. You still have to check every formula. You still have to validate assumptions and confirm that the structure is internally consistent. Now, the tool also does not connect to the systems where finance work actually lives. It has no native access to your Excel files or your reporting folders or your project environments. Every analysis starts with you manually extracting the data, pasting it in, and then manually moving the output somewhere else. Now, in practice, the tool shifts where the effort goes rather than actually reducing the overall effort. So that is the problem with using a prompt-based tool for finance. Now, here is what is actually changing right now in how AI is being used for financial work. The shift from prompting to systems. Up until recently, the way everyone used AI for finance was prompting. You write a question, you get a response. You write another question, you get another response. The entire workflow lives inside a conversation. Now, that approach worked well enough for one-off tasks, but it never solved the core problem, which is that finance work is not a series of isolated questions. It is a structured process that needs to stay internally consistent from start to finish. What has changed in the last few months is that it is now possible to build reusable financial systems inside AI instead of just prompting for answers. The shift is from asking questions to defining processes. Instead of writing a new prompt every time you need to run a variance analysis, you build the analysis once as a system and then you run it on new data whenever you need it. The logic is stored, the validation is built in, and the output structure stays consistent across every execution. So this is where Claude is positioned differently from ChatGPT. Claude does not just answer questions, it executes workflows. When I build a financial model in Claude, the process does not reset after each response. It progresses through connected steps inside a persistent environment. Data extraction, cleaning, calculation, validation, and output generation all happen inside the same workflow. Each step builds on the previous one, and the logic stays internally consistent because the system is maintaining the full context throughout. In a prompt-based setup, you rebuild the process every time. You restate the logic, you re-explain the structure, and hope the model follows the same path that it did last time. Whereas in a system-based setup, you update the inputs and the system handles the rest. A monthly variance analysis, a quarterly model update, a weekly cash flow review. The structure stays the same and only the data changes. And over time, this compounds. Each execution reinforces the same process rather than introducing new variation. Now, this also changes your role in the process. In a prompt-based environment, you are responsible for directing every single step. Every stage requires manual input, adjustment, validation. Whereas in a system-based environment, the workflow contains the logic and the sequence. You oversee execution. You adjust inputs where needed, and you review the outputs. So your time shifts from running the analysis to making decisions based on it. The hidden bottleneck. Now, there is a specific reason why this system-based approach works better for finance than prompting does, and it comes down to context. Finance is one of those domains where context is not supplementary. It is the work itself. A margin figure is not meaningful unless it is grounded in the underlying revenue base. A forecast is not reliable unless it stays consistent with the assumptions embedded earlier in the model. A contract summary is not useful unless it preserves the link to clauses and exceptions that define its actual implications. And when the system loses the thread, the conclusion becomes weaker or just outright wrong. Now, finance teams do not work from a single document. They work across annual reports, budgets, board materials, models, regulatory filings, and source data all simultaneously. And Claude can retain all of that within a single working context and relate one component to another without you having to reintroduce information that was already established earlier. Now, ChatGPT fragments this process. Earlier assumptions get dropped, caveats get lost, and by the middle of a complex task, the model is weighing recent inputs more heavily than the foundational context you set at the beginning. Now, in finance, this shows up as forecasts that no longer align with the underlying models, summaries that omit critical conditions from footnotes, or comparisons that exclude assumptions that were introduced earlier in the analysis. The output still, looks coherent, but it no longer reflects the actual logic of the work. There's also a structural issue that is easy to miss. Now, financial data is inherently structured. Rows, columns, time periods, footnotes, labels, dependencies. And when that structure gets disrupted during processing, the meaning of the data changes. ChatGPT often splits tables incorrectly or separates footnotes from the line items that they qualify. The numbers are still technically present, but the relationships between them are broken. Claude retains larger portions of documents and their structural relationships within a single context, which reduces the risk of misinterpretation. In finance, structure is not formatting, it is part of the logic. The real differentiator. This is probably the most important difference between the two tools when it comes to finance work. In ChatGPT, the numbers and the narrative are generated together in a single response. The calculation and the explanation are blended. And that means if a number is wrong, it is buried inside fluent, professional sounding text, but there's no clean way to isolate where the error came from. You have to manually reconstruct the entire logic to figure out what went wrong. Claude treats these as distinct layers. The data is processed first, calculations are performed in a control step, the logic is then validated, and only then is the explanation generated. And this separation is what makes it possible to actually audit the output. You can trace a number back to the calculation that produced it, and trace that calculation back to the data it used. And once the calculation layer is separated from the explanation layer, the likelihood of hidden errors being embedded within fluent text drops significantly. The output may appear simple, but the underlying process is controlled and verifiable, which is what finance actually requires. This also enables validation before results are presented. Claude runs a verification pass at the end of every workflow. Now, in my processes, I routinely see formula counts in the hundreds, all recalculated with 0 errors. If a number does not trace back cleanly, it gets flagged before the output is finalized. The system also logs data quality issues it encountered during extraction, so you know exactly where to apply your own judgment. This is the difference between a tool that gives you an answer and a system that gives you an answer that you can actually defend. What actually changes? Let me make this concrete. When I run a financial modeling workflow in Claude, I point it at a folder of source documents, quarterly PDFs, spreadsheets, whatever the source data is. Claude reads the files, extracts the data, standardizes the line items across all periods, builds the model with formula-driven calculations, generates forecasts with multiple scenarios, and exports a structured Excel file with audit logs and extraction records. So that entire sequence runs inside one workflow. I am just reviewing the output instead of managing the pipeline. When new data arrives next quarter, I do not rebuild anything. The same workflow runs on the new files using the same extraction logic, the same model structure, and the same validation checks. The output is consistent across periods because the process has not changed, only the inputs have. And this is how finance systems are supposed to work. And it's something that is structurally impossible in a prompt-based setup where every session starts from 0. The same applies to reporting. When I build a presentation from financial data in Claude, it does not go straight from numbers to slides. It builds the model layer first. It validates every formula, and only then does it generate the presentation. So during the presentation phase, It converts slides to images. It runs visual QA. It detects layout issues. It fixes them and then regenerates the deck. And the final output comes out clean because the system reviewed and corrected its own work before delivering it. The presentation follows the structure of a real financial review: executive summary, budget to actual bridge, driver decomposition, and prioritized recommendations. And because everything is anchored to the same data source, the numbers are consistent from the model through to the final slide. Why this matters now? Most finance professionals are still at the prompting stage. They're using AI to speed up individual tasks, but they have not made the shift to building systems that execute entire workflows. And that shift is what separates getting faster at manual work from actually just removing manual work. And when you operate at the prompting level, you are still the bottleneck. You are the one holding context between steps. You're the one verifying every output. You're the one rebuilding the process each time new data comes in. And when you operate at the system level, is what we're talking about, the process carries itself, and your role shifts to reviewing results and then making decisions. Now, ChatGPT is good for what it does, but finance requires outputs that are correct, not outputs that just look correct. It requires processes that are repeatable, not interactions that vary each time. It requires traceability, not just answers. And it requires a system that maintains context across a full workflow, not one that fragments as complexity increases. And that's why I switched. And if you're doing real finance work with AI, it's worth evaluating whether the tool you're using actually meets those requirements. If you're working in finance and you want to see more of these workflows in action, then the rest of the channel covers exactly that. I'll see you next time.